I have told this story exactly once before to a sealed hearing of the Compact Worlds Tribunal, and I told it under oath with the understanding that most of the record would be classified. For 50 years, that was 31 years ago. Classification has lapsed. I am 83 years old and I have nothing left to protect except the truth, so I will tell it now. The way it actually happened, not the way the official summaries describe it, not the way the commemorative panels, the Omelin Memorial Hall depict it, and certainly not the way the hegemony's surviving diplomatic corps still insists on framing it when they occasionally surface at academic conferences and try to argue that what occurred was a misunderstanding of protocol. It was not a misunderstanding of protocol. I want to say something else first before the chronology begins, because the chronology without this context is a story about a legal mechanism, and while the legal mechanism is real and important and the central fact of what happened, it is not the only fact. The other fact is that the hegemony had been treating the Compact World signatories as inferiors for so long, so consistently, so casually, so thoroughly, as a matter of institutional habit rather than conscious policy, that by the time the crisis arrived, a significant number of people in positions of authority on both sides stopped being capable of imagining that the situation could be anything other than what it appeared to be. Hegemony could not imagine that a treaty they had always treated as decorative was operative. The Compact World's mid-level officials could not imagine that a provision they had been told was ceremonial was the most consequential single clause in 400 years of interstellar agreements. Keithar the Third Ascendant could not imagine that the roster of detainees he had authorized was carrying anything he needed to check, and a deputy director at a secondary hub could not imagine that a junior attaché's reading of an archaic treaty. Klaus was correct, because it would require him to imagine that his entire institution had been wrong about something important for longer than he had been alive. This is the thing about certainty that has occupied me for the better part of my professional life. It is most dangerous, not when it is malicious, but when it is merely habitual. The hegemony was not in the main evil they were accustomed. They had been the dominant power in their region of space for so long that dominance had ceased to feel like a posture and had become instead a fact of nature, as unquestionable and unremarkable as the orbital mechanics that govern their home system. You do not question the orbital mechanics. You do not check the treaty to see whether the clause you have been ignoring for 4 centuries is actually dormant. Why would you? Things are as they are. The smaller parties accept what they are given. The accords are decorative. Treaty keeper rank is ceremonial. The junior attaché is being overly literal until they are not. I was 32 years old when I was assigned to the permanent mission at Valdrich Prime, the third time in my career that the diplomatic corps had posted me somewhere I genuinely did not want to go. The first time was a border station on the edge of the Scar Reach, where he failed twice. Winter and the local liaison officer smelled melt powerfully of fermented oil seed paste. The second was a listening post embedded with a theocratic conclave faction that regarded human beings as spiritually incomplete and made no effort to conceal this view. Valdrich Prime comparison offered climate controlled quarters, reasonable food, and Architecture that was genuinely beautiful, vast stone buildings with arched ceilings that rang like bells when the wind moved through them. The Valdry simply give they owned at the galaxy, which made them far easier to work with than zealots, because ownership, at least you can negotiate around. Contempt has practical edges, faith doesn't. I was a junior attaché third tier with a portfolio covering commercial treaty verification and a supplementary assignment reviewing the Amhara Accords compliance filings. This last assignment had been given to me because no one more senior wanted it. The Accords were old, older than the current hegemony, older than 3 of the 4 civilizations that had originally signed them, older than the current form of the Compact Worlds Council itself. They predated the hegemony's absorption of the Dreth territories by about 400 years and the formal seating of Earth's delegation in the Compact Assembly by roughly the same margin, though not the same 400 years. The document itself existed in 7 languages, 2 of which were spoken by species no longer extant, and the binding clauses were written in a legal idiom so archaic that the hegemony's own scholars had spent decades arguing about whether particular provisions were operative or merely ceremonial. This ambiguity was, I later understood, intentional on the hegemony's part. They had let it fester because the ambiguity served them. An ambiguous provision cannot be enforced cleanly, and anything that cannot be enforced cleanly can be ignored in practice while being deferred. In theory, the hegemony was expert at deferral. They had been deferring the Velimhara compliance filings for so long that the filings had their own subarchive sorted by the century, which they had been received and not acted upon. My job for the first 6 months was to read those filings, all of them. I do not recommend this as a path to professional fulfillment, but I will say that it taught me the Accords more thoroughly than any other course of study could have managed. By the time I had worked through the 3rd archive century, I understood the document the way a locksmith understands his lock. He has spent a month disassembling, not because the lock is elegant, but because he has held every pin in his fingers. I knew which provisions the Ya had always honored because honoring them cost nothing. I knew which provisions they had bent and how far, and I had begun to understand with a creeping and at first unwelcome clarity which provisions they had never read carefully enough. One of those provisions was Article 14. Article 14 of the Velimhara Accords was listed in the Hegman's own official summary as a ceremonial designation clause. Their summary described it as establishing an honorific rank treaty keeper to be held by a senior representative of each signatory power, the holder to be granted symbolic immunity during formal sessions of the Accord Council, and entitled to wear a particular sash at treaty ceremonies. The summary noted that this rank had fallen into disuse, that no living treaty keeper had been formally invested since the last human holder, one Admiral Brennan CS, had retired and died 23 years prior, and that the rank was therefore currently vacant on the human side of the ledger. What the summary did not note, because whoever wrote it had clearly not read past the first operative clause, was the second operative clause, which specified what happened if a treaty keeper was killed, not died in office. Killed. The distinction was precise in the archaic legal idiom, and it was not subtle. Once You understood the idiom, the clause. Used a word that had only one meaning. Deliberate taking of life by an authority of a signatory power, and the consequence specified was also not subtle. It was the total dissolution of all restraint clauses binding every non-hegemony signatory to the accords. All restraint clauses. I read Article 14 on a Tuesday morning in the third month of my assignment in a climate-controlled reading room with a cup of tea going cold beside me and the sound of wind through the arched ceiling above. I read it twice, then I sat it down and sat for a while looking at the far wall. I was a junior attaché third tier. I was not authorized to draw strategic conclusions from treaty documents without submitting them for senior review. I wrote a memo. I submitted it through the standard channel. I received an acknowledgement of receipt 11 days later, and then nothing for 4 months, and then a polite note from a deputy director informing me that my interpretation had been reviewed and found to represent an overly literal reading of a ceremonial provision that had not been operative in any meaningful sense for centuries, and that I should return my focus to the commercial verification portfolio. I kept a copy of the memo. I kept a copy of the response. I kept them for 31 years through 6 postings, a marriage, a divorce, a second marriage, the loss of my left eye in an incident I will not describe here, and a retirement to a small house on a coastal ridge where the sea makes a sound at night that I have never been able to adequately describe. I kept them because I knew what I had read, and because I had learned by then that the hardest thing about being right too early is that no one will let you be right until the cost of the alternative becomes impossible to ignore. I will tell you about Sarah now. She was not a friend of mine, not at the time. We knew each other the way junior mission staff, no mid-career military personnel assigned to the same complex. We had shared a cafeteria, attended the same briefings, exchanged the occasional professional courtesy in hallways and waiting rooms. She was a general by then ground forces with a record, the Scarith border campaigns that had made her genuinely famous in military circles and essentially invisible in diplomatic ones. The diplomatic corps and the military branches did not exactly share personnel files. I knew she was competent. I knew she was not a woman who wasted words. I did not know until it became relevant that she held the treat. I kept her rank. I want to spend a moment on who she actually was, because the Memorial Hall tends to depict her as a monument, and monuments are useful, but they are not people. She had grown up on a colony world near the Scarith border, a world that, when she was young, had been close enough to the contested zone that the families there had maintained a particular quality of practical alertness that never entirely left anyone raised in it. Her parents had both served in the colonial defense forces. She had followed them and moved into the regular military on merit, and spent the first decade of her career in postings that the diplomatic corps would have considered hardship assignments, and that she apparently regarded as simply the places where the work was. She was known among the officers she had commanded as someone who said what she meant and did not elaborate past the point where elaboration added something. She was known among her peers as someone who had read the strategic calculus of the Scarith campaigns more clearly than most of the senior officers above her, and who had been right in 2 specific engagements in ways that those senior Officers had preferred not to publicize. At the time, she had 2 children, a son, on a world in the inner compact who worked in agricultural engineering, daughter who had followed her into the military and was at the time of the Amhara posting a junior officer in the Fleet branch. I have never spoken with either of them. I have wanted to several times over the years, and I have always stopped short because I am not sure what I would say that would be worth the weight of the conversation. Perhaps that is cowardice. I have made my peace with the possibility that it is. The reinstatement had happened quietly about 2 years after my memo was filed and ignored. A procedural committee reviewing the accords had recommended that the vacancy be filled for continuity purposes, and the recommendation had been implemented at a level well below the one where my memo had been reviewed and dismissed. The appointment was listed in the Compact World's Gazette as a 3-line administrative notice on page 47 of an issue that also covered a municipal water rights dispute on a colony world that no one except the colonists cared about. Omelin had accepted the designation, worn the sash at the one ceremonial occasion that required it, and then gone back to running logistics and strategy for the ground forces command without any apparent awareness that she was carrying the functional weight of a 400-year-old legal mechanism that no one had ever bothered to read carefully. This is the part of the story that I find most difficult to sit with. Not because it is the worst part, it is not the worst part, but because it is the part where I am most clearly implicated. My memo had been dismissed, yes, but I had not pushed further. I had not escalated through informal channels. I had not found a way in the 15 years between the filing of that memo and the day of the execution to ensure that the person carrying the treaty keeper rank knew what she was carrying, whether I could have done that given the institutional constraints is something I have reviewed many times and cannot fully answer. I believe I could have tried harder. I believe it would probably not have changed what Kethar did, but it might have changed what Ohm knew. Walking into that detention and knowing is different from not knowing, even when the outcome is the same, and I hold that particular failure quietly because there is nowhere to put it. I had left Valdry Prime by then, reassigned to the Joint Treaty Commission circuit, where I spent the next several years doing the kind of work that keeps interstellar agreements in approximately functional repair, the endless, unglamorous, necessary labor of verification and amendment and dispute resolution that fills the actual daily life of diplomacy, and that no one ever produces documentaries about. I was good at it. I was not brilliant. I had no special gift for the theatrical moments that make careers. What I had was the ability to read a document until it gave up its secrets, and the patience to sit with what I had read until I understood it completely. When the crisis at Velimhara Station began, I was 47 years old and serving as a senior verification officer at the Commission's secondary hub. 2 transit jumps from the hegemony border. I was not at that point part of any policy loop that touched the hegemony directly. I learned what was happening the way most people at my level learned things, through official bulletins, that through the particular quality of silence that descends on a commission hub when the people at the top are having conversations no one below them is supposed to hear, and through a very old set of instincts that had been calibrated specifically to the hegemony's patterns of behavior. The immediate precipitant, as the subsequent inquiries would establish, was a border dispute in the Velimhara corridor, the same region, not coincidentally, where the original accords had been negotiated, that the hegemony had been pressing for a revision of transit rights through the corridor for years, using the standard mechanism of simultaneous economic pressure and diplomatic delay that they had refined over centuries into something close to an art form. The compact worlds delegation had been resisting also in the standard manner, which meant that the two sides had been meeting formally at regular intervals and saying nothing of substance to each other while the underlying situation slowly accumulated tension the way a geological fault accumulates stress. General Omelin had been sent to the corridor as part of the compact world's military presence, which was not large but which was real, positioned at Velimhara Station as a statement that the transit corridor was not undefended. This was standard strategic posture. The hegemony had their own military presence in the region, also standard, also positioned as a statement rather than an immediate threat. The two forces had been conducting what amounted to an armed staring contest for about 14 months, when the hegemony's regional commander, a Valdrich officer named Cathavar the Third Ascendant, they had a naming convention that I had always found both pompous and confusing, decided that the staring contest needed to be resolved by a gesture. The gesture he chose was the arrest of the compact world's delegation attending a routine liaison meeting aboard Amhara Station. The arrest was framed as a detention pending investigation of alleged protocol violations, a charge so vague and so procedurally absurd that it would not have survived contact with any functional legal system, including the hegemony's own. But Cathavar the Third Ascendant was not operating within the hegemony's legal system. He was operating within the logic of coercion, which does not require charges to be valid, only to be stated. The detention of 14 compact worlds officials, including 3 military officers, was intended to demonstrate that the hegemony's patience with the transit corridor dispute had an end, and that the end had been reached. What Cavar did not do, what no one in his chain of command appears to have done, though the subsequent hegemony inquiry tried very hard to suggest otherwise, was check the roster of detainees against the Velimhara Accords signatory records. General Sarah Omelin was among the 14. She held at the moment of her arrest the valid and currently operative rank of Treaty-Keeper under Article 3 of the Amhara Accords, invested in accordance with the full procedural requirements and recorded in the official accords registry. She was in the precise legal language of the document a protected officer of the compact under the terms of the original agreement. Her detention was in that same precise legal language an act of aggression against the accord itself. Kivar the Third Ascendant held her for 11 days. On the 12th day, when the Compact Worlds Council had formally demanded her release through every available channel, and the hegemony central administration had spent 11 days doing exactly what hegemony administrations always did, deferring, reviewing, acknowledging receipt, and not acting. Kevar issued an order that his own subsequent deposition described as a security measure necessary under the Circumstances, he had her executed. The official charge delivered as a single line administrative notation in the detention record was interference with hegemony security operations. The method was the standard hegemony summary proceeding, which required no court, no advocate, and no appeal. She was dead within the hour of the order being issued, and the notification to the Compact Worlds mission was delivered 3 days later in the form of a formal communication informing them that the detainee had been processed and that her personal effects were available for collection at the station administrator's office. They sent the notification on a Wednesday. I know this because I received my own notification, not official, but from a contact within the mission who had served with me at Valdrich Prime on the Thursday. She had been executed Tuesday. I sat for a long time after I read that message. I was not a policymaker. I was a senior verification officer at a secondary hub. 2 transit jumps from the border. I had no operational authority over anything that was about to happen. I had a filing cabinet, a copy of the Velem Hera Accords, and a 15-year-old memo that a deputy director had politely told me represented an overly literal reading of a ceremonial provision. I pulled the memo out of the cabinet. I read it again, then I wrote a new memo, much shorter, much more direct, and I sent it to every address I had access to, including 3 I was not technically authorized to use. I sent it at 11 minutes 8:00 in the morning. By noon I had 3 acknowledgments of receipt. By 4 in the afternoon I had a priority call back from the senior legal counsel of the Compact Worlds Treaty Office, woman named Aldress Vane, whom I had met exactly once at a commission conference in another context entirely, and who opened the conversation by asking me if I was absolutely certain about my reading of Article 14. I told her I had been certain for 15 years. She was quiet for a moment, then she said, "How long have you been sitting on this?" I told her. Another silence, longer this time. "Then we need to convene." The convening took 8 days, which under the circumstances was fast. The Compact Worlds Council did not move quickly by nature. It was a federated body representing 23 worlds with divergent interest and a decision-making process specifically designed to prevent any single member from acting unilaterally, which meant that it was also specifically designed to prevent anyone from acting at all until every possible objection had been aired and exhausted. 8 days was, given what was at stake, and given the political pressures involved, essentially immediate. I was not the most important person in the room when the convening finally assembled. I was not even close to the most important person in the room. The room contained the full council, delegation plus treaty scholars, military advisors, legal counsel from 6 member worlds, and 3 retired diplomats whose combined experience exceeded a century. What I was in that room was the person who had read Article 14 most carefully and lived with it the longest, and so I was seated at the table rather than in the observer gallery, and I was asked to walk the room through my analysis. I took 40 minutes. I had the original Accords text on the display with the relevant provisions highlighted. I had the archaic legal idiom annotated with the scholarly consensus on meaning, including 3 separate academic studies that had reached the same interpretive conclusion. I had reached 15 years earlier, none of which had apparently crossed the desk of the deputy director who had informed me I was being overly literal. I had the chain of record establishing Omelin's Treaty status, the procedural committee recommendation, the formal investment, the entry in the accords registry, all of it, and I had the Hegelman's own detention record, the order and the notification, which together constituted a clear and documented chain of agency from the deliberate taking of a treaty-keeper's life to the authority that had authorized it. When I finished, the room was quiet for a moment that felt longer than it was. Then the senior legal counsel for the Scarith member Worlds, a broad-shouldered man named Provost Ed Havoc, said, and there is no interpretation of Article 14 that reads this as dormant. I said there was not. He said, and the consequence clause is automatic, not discretionary. I said it was. He sat back in his chair. He had the look of a man who has been handed something he did not want and cannot put down. Aldous Vane from the treaty office said, then we are not choosing to invoke the clause. The clause has already been invoked by them by killing her. I said, that was my reading. Council delegate from Velimhara, small, very still woman named Counselor Mort, whose world sat closest to the corridor and who had therefore been living with the transit dispute longer than anyone else in the room, said, then the only question before this body is whether we acknowledge what has already happened. Nobody argued with her in that first moment, which surprised me a little, but the arguments came as they always do when the initial quiet had run out. The delegate from Orvith Station, a commercial hub world whose economy was integrated with the hegemonies in ways that 3 generations of political arrangements had made difficult to disentangle, raised the practical objections first, and he raised them in the careful, measured tone of someone who knows that his position will look like cowardice in any historical account and who has decided that historical accounts are not the most important thing. He said that, acknowledging the invocation committed the council to a course whose consequences could not be fully modeled. He said that the hegemony's response to a perceived assertion of treaty violation was unpredictable, and that the range of unpredictability included outcomes that would be harmful to member worlds in ways that the legal analysis did not and could not address. He said, in the end, that the question of whether the clause was operative was legally separable from the question of whether it was wise to say so aloud. Aldous Vane said with a patience that I recognized as the kind that is maintained by an act of will. The clause being operative is not a position we are taking, it is a fact the hegemony created when they killed her. The question before this body is whether we tell them, the delegate from Orvith Station said, and if we tell them, we lose the deniability that currently allows us to use the treaty framework as a stabilizing mechanism. There was a pause, then Counselor Havoc, who had been quiet since his initial exchange with me, said, what treaty framework? They detained 14 of our people and killed one of them under a charge that their own legal system would not sustain. The framework has already been violated. The question is whether we notice. This was in retrospect the pivot of the deliberation, not the legal argument. The legal argument was settled before the meeting began. The pivot was the question of whether the council was willing to say in formal terms that they had noticed that they had read the document that the hegemony's assumption of their inferiors' complacent acceptance of what happened at Velmhara Station was incorrect. The arguments continued for another 4 hours. They covered every dimension of the political calculus, the commercial implications, the military positioning questions, the risks to the member worlds along the border, the likely hegemony responses at each stage of a potential escalation, and the very difficult problem of what the Council's authority actually amounted to if it acknowledged a legal right and then did not act on it. This last point was made quietly and only once by Councillor Merritt, and it ended the argument about whether to proceed more decisively than any of the legal analysis had. She said, "If we acknowledge Article 14 and then do nothing, we will have demonstrated that our legal framework means nothing unless we are already strong enough that it was never necessary, and 23 worlds will have watched us demonstrate that." Nobody argued with her after that. The vote to formally acknowledge the invocation of Article 14 was 17-6. The 6 dissenting votes were all procedural objections, concerns about timing, about communication protocols, about the sequence in which the hegemony should be notified. None of the 6 disputed the legal reading. When I note this, I am not noting it to suggest that the outcome was inevitable. It was not inevitable. It was chosen by people with authority and responsibility, after deliberation and with clear understanding of what followed from it. I want that on the record. The clause did not fire itself. Human beings decided to recognize what it required and acted accordingly. The notification to the hegemony was drafted by the Treaty Office and reviewed by every member world's legal counsel before it was sent. It ran to 4 pages of careful, precise language establishing the chain of fact, the treaty keeper status, the documentation of the execution, the applicable provisions, and the legal consequence. The last paragraph stated without embellishment or threat or flourish that pursuant to Article 14, Section 2 of the Velumara Accords, all restraint clauses binding the Compact World signatories were hereby dissolved, effective from the date of General Omelin's death. It was signed by Aldrich Vane in her capacity as Senior Treaty Counsel, countersigned by the full Council delegation, and transmitted to the hegemon's diplomatic mission at the Standard Treaty Channel. On the morning of the 9th day after my phone call with Aldrich Vane, which was the 21st day after Sarah's execution, I was not in the room when the hegemony's response arrived. By that point I had been transferred, not punitively, I want to be clear, but practically, because the situation had moved well past what a senior verification officer at a secondary hub was usefully equipped to handle, and because there were people who needed to be in that room who were not me, I was reassigned to an administrative position in the treaty office where I had access to the incoming communications, but no operational role. I read the hegemony's response from a desk in an archive room that smelled of dry air and old processing seals. Their initial response was what I would have predicted, a formal assertion that the notification was procedurally invalid, accompanied by a demand that the Compact Worlds Council retract the communication pending a joint review of the Accord's operative provisions. The tone was measured and not quite confident, which told me that Someone in the hegemony's treaty office had read Article 14 by that point and was beginning to understand what they were dealing with. The demand for retraction and joint review was in the language of their own diplomatic tradition, and acknowledgement that they did not have a strong position, because if they had a strong position, they would have stated it, not asked for a process. The Compact Worlds Council did not retract. They sent a 2-paragraph response acknowledging receipt of the hegemony's communication and noting that the factual chain underlying the treaty office notification was not in dispute, and that the legal consequence of those facts was therefore also not in dispute. The response did not include a counter-demand. It did not include a threat. It contained in the last sentence a single line that I have quoted from memory at every academic presentation I have given in the 30 years since. The Council remains available to discuss the humanitarian dimensions of what follows. Humanitarian dimensions, 2 words carrying the weight of everything the Council was not saying about what had already been said. In motion, the hegemony sent 3 more communications over the following week, each one escalating slightly in both formality and urgency, each one repeating the core demand for retraction and joint review, and each one receiving the same brief, courteous, unmovable response. I read each exchange from my archive desk. I drank a great deal of bad coffee during that period. I slept poorly, not because I was afraid of what was coming. I had understood what was coming since I first read Article 14, and I had had 15 years to make my peace with it. But because I found myself thinking about Sarah, about what she had been doing the morning she was taken into custody, about whether she had known in those 11 days that the legal weight she was carrying might matter, about whether knowing would have changed anything for her, and whether it would have made the end better or worse, or simply different. I did not know her well enough to answer those questions. I still don't. On the 40th day after the notification, the Compact Worlds fleet, which had been repositioning quietly and without announcement since the day of the vote, became visible from the hegemony's border stations, not in the Velimhara corridor, which was what the hegemony's military commanders had spent the previous month preparing to defend through the Aldrich Gap, 600,000 km north of the corridor's primary transit lane, where the hegemony had 3 monitoring stations, 43 active patrols, and a standing doctrine of confident insufficiency. The doctrine of confident insufficiency was a strategic posture the hegemony had maintained for about 200 years, based on the foundational assumption that no compact world's government would authorize a significant deployment to the Aldrich Gap. The political cost of massing forces there would be unacceptable to 3 of the 23 member worlds whose economies depended on maintaining predictable commercial relations with the hegemony. The doctrine was coherent under the conditions that had existed before the invocation of Article 14. Under those conditions, the Compact Worlds Council had been bound by the restraint clauses, which place specific limits on force projection beyond the corridor. Under those conditions, any commander contemplating an approach through the Aldrich Gap would have been working against not just hegemony defenses, but the accords themselves. The restraint clauses were dissolved. The accords were not. The accords still existed. The hegemony was still a signatory, but the provisions that had functioned as constraints on the compact world's freedom of action were gone, and what remained were the provisions that defined what the hegemony had originally agreed to, the things they had promised in 400 years of treaty language not to do to their neighbors. Keith, the third ascendant, had done one of them. I need to say something about what was happening inside the hegemony during those 40 days, because the story looks very different from that side of the event, and because I have had access through the declassified hegemony tribunal records produced during the Joint Commission review to some understanding of it. The hegemony was not monolithic in its response to the notification. It never was. The hegemony was a large, old, internally complex civilization with factions and rivalries and institutional memories going back further than the Accords themselves, and when the treaty office notification arrived, it landed in the middle of a set of internal tensions that had been developing for years. There was a faction within the hegemon's treaty apparatus, senior enough to matter, not senior enough to prevail, that had known or suspected for some time that the Vilhara Accords were not what the official summaries described. This faction had been attempting through the normal channels of bureaucratic persuasion to get a comprehensive review conducted. They had been blocked not because anyone in authority actively opposed the review, but because no one in authority particularly wanted to know what a comprehensive review would find. This is another version of the problem of certainty I described earlier. The hegemony's leadership had arranged its institutional architecture to protect their understanding of the situation rather than to test it, and the result was that the people who knew the most about the Accords were the people with the least ability to do anything with what they knew. When the notification arrived, the first response from the heated central administration was to route it to the treaty verification office, where the faction I described had been sitting for years with their concerns and their blocked review requests. The faction read Article 14. They had already read Article 14. They had read it as part of the review they had been trying to get conducted, and so the speed of their response was not the speed of people discovering something new. It was the speed of people who had been waiting for someone in authority to finally require them to say what they already knew. Their analysis was complete within 36 hours of the notification's receipt. It confirmed everything the treaty office had stated. It also confirmed something the treaty office had not included in the notification, which was that the consequence clause in Article 14 had been drafted with the specific input of two of the original non-hegemony signatories, meaning that the clause's stringency was not an oversight or an ambiguity favoring interpretation. It was a deliberate negotiated provision that the hegemony of 400 years ago had agreed to and signed. The hegemony had known this once. The knowledge had been filed away, categorized as historical, and eventually lost to institutional memory in the same way that the deputy director at my secondary hub had lost my memo. The analysis was delivered to the senior administration on the 19th day after the notification. The senior administration spent 3 days reviewing it. Then they sent the fourth communication, the one that invoked the personal authority of the four sovereign council, which tells you something about how the internal review had landed. When an institution discovers that it has been wrong about something fundamental, the immediate response almost never. Acknowledgement, the immediate response, is an attempt to impose authority over the situation, because authority is what you have left when the legal ground has shifted under your feet. I was watching the monitoring feeds from my archive desk when the fleet cleared the gap. I had a cup of tea this time. I had switched from coffee when the insomnia became a consistent problem, and the tea was going cold in exactly the same way. The tea had gone cold in the Valdrich Prime reading room 15 years earlier when I had first understood what Article 14 meant. I noticed this and found it appropriate in a way I cannot quite articulate. The fleet was not small. The compact worlds had 23 member worlds, and 23 worlds, when they agree on a purpose, can put a considerable number of ships into space. They had been building not in secret because the treaty framework had always permitted construction within certain limits, and they had stayed within the limits right up until the limits were dissolved, and they had been building with patience, the way you build when you know that your agreements only protect you until the moment the other party decides that agreements no longer opes to them. Admiral Telluris commanded the fleet. She was at that point 58 years old, and she had spent most of her career in exactly the kinds of assignments that the hegemony's strategic doctrine had assumed would never produce a seasoned opponent. Border defense, convoy protection, joint exercises with member world forces, the slow accumulation of tactical and logistical experience in conditions that did not look dramatic and did not produce decorations. She had served with Omelin in 2 of the Scarath engagements as fleet support to ground operations, and she had known her well enough that the news of the execution had reached her as something more personal than a strategic event. She had, according to the operations brief she filed afterward, which I have read 3 times, because it is the most precisely written document I have encountered in a career full of documents, described her operational objective in the following terms: demonstrate that the dissolution of the restraint clauses is real. Do not initiate, make the choice of what follows a hegemon choice, not ours. This was strategically the correct objective. It was also the hardest kind of objective to maintain, because the fleet was large enough that the hegemony's patrol forces would have been aware at every moment of for the 40 days that followed that the calculus of an engagement did not favor them. There were officers in that fleet who understood this and who found the restraint difficult. I know this from the after-action reviews, which include several direct accounts from junior officers who describe those days as some of the most professionally testing of their careers, not because the situation was physically dangerous in the way combat is dangerous, but because the discipline required to hold a posture of visible force without using it is its own kind of hard work, and because the reason for the restraint was the ongoing detention of compact worlds personnel at Velmhera Station, which was not an abstraction. The hegemony's border stations transmitted emergency alerts. The patrol vessels moved to intercept positions that, as someone in the fleet coordination office later described to me, could charitably be called hopeful. The communications from Hegemony Command Central started arriving at the compact World's Treaty Channel within 17 minutes of the fleet emergence from the gap, not through the standard diplomatic mission but directly to the council delegations emergency line, which was itself an acknowledgement of how thoroughly the normal process had been abandoned. The council delegation was not an emergency session when the calls began. They were in a scheduled administrative meeting, reviewing a budget line item related to archival preservation. I know this because one of the delegates told me afterward, with the slightly dazed expression of someone who has had their sense of scale recalibrated very suddenly. They moved to the primary session chamber. They took their seats. The hegemony's emergency communications were cued and displayed. I was not there. I was in the archive room, but I have read the session transcript, which was declassified with the rest of the record, and I have spoken at length with 3 of the delegates who were present, and I will tell you what happened as accurately as I can reconstruct it. I want to say something about that room before I describe what occurred in it, because the room itself is part of the record in ways that the official transcript does not capture. The primary session chamber of the Compact Worlds Council was not a dramatic space. It was functional, a medium-sized rectangular room with a long table, adequate lighting, acoustic treatment in the ceiling panels, and a communications array along the eastern wall that had been updated 3 times in the past decade and still managed to look slightly provisional. There were no murals, there were no grand windows. The floor was a composite material that had been chosen for durability rather than aesthetics, and that had developed over the years a particular worn quality. The delegate seats, that was the accumulated evidence of how much time people had spent sitting at that table. The delegates who gathered in that room on the day the fleet emerged from the gap were not as individuals imposing figures. They were bureaucrats in the most precise sense of the word, people who had risen through the administrative structures of their respective member worlds by demonstrating over careers of years or decades that they could be trusted with the slow and often thankless work of keeping complex agreements functional. Most of them had not expected when they entered public service to be in a room where the decisions made would be described in historical accounts for the next several centuries. They were there because the ordinary machinery of their institutions had placed them there, and they were doing what the people in those seats were responsible for doing, and the fact that what they were doing happened to be consequential does not make McNam extraordinary in the way that the commemorations sometimes suggest. They were, in other words, exactly the kind of people that decisions of this weight should rest with, not heroes, not visionaries, people who had read the documents. The first hegemony communication requested an immediate suspension of fleet operations pending emergency diplomatic consultation. The council delegation listened to it. Then they placed, without speaking, without comment, without discussion, the treaty office notification on the session table, the physical printed version, stamped and signed, that had been transmitted on the 9th day. They set it in the center of the table and left it there. This gesture, which the session transcript records as senior delegate Marit Mort, placed the treaty notification document on the central table, was understood by everyone in the room and requires a moment of explanation for anyone who was not there. The notification was not placed on the table as a threat. It was placed there as a reference. It said, without any of the parties needing to speak the Words, here is the document, here is what it says, here is what happened. Everything that follows from this point is downstream of those facts, and those facts do not change because the party responsible for them is now uncomfortable. The second communication repeated the request for suspension and added a formal invocation of the hegemon's right to emergency mediation. Under the commerce provisions of the Accords, the session chair, a delegate named Councillor Fail Andrus, a very thin man with a quiet voice that I had heard described as the verbal equivalent of a closed door, said the commerce provisions are Article 22, Article 14 has superseded the applicability of Article 22 in the present circumstance. If the hegemony wishes to initiate Article 22 proceedings, they may do so after a complete cessation of hostilities in the Vel Amhara corridor, a full withdrawal of all hegemony forces from the station, and the return in full of all Compact Worlds personnel detained during the past 41 days. He said it once, he did not repeat it. The third communication, and I will note that all three of these communication arrived within a span of about 22 minutes, which gives you some sense of how the atmosphere at Hegemony Command Central had changed since the fleet emerged from the gap, invoked the personal authority of the Hegemony Sovereign Council, and demanded to speak directly with the Compact World's senior delegate, Councillor Morit, the small, very still woman from Amhara, who had said at the deliberation 8 days earlier that the only question before the body was whether they acknowledged what had already happened. Was the senior delegate. She listened to the communication. She looked at the treaty office notification in the center of the table. Then she said, "Tell them we have received their communication and that the fleet's orders are unchanged." That was all she said. The transcript records this as the dear delegate Mort directed that the hegemony's communication be acknowledged and that fleet operations continue as directed. What the transcript does not capture is the quality of the room in that moment, the specific weighted silence that follows when something enormous has become irreversible and everyone present understands it simultaneously. I know that silence. I have been in rooms where it has existed, though not that room on that day, and I recognize its description when people who were present try to put it into words. It is not the silence of shock. It is not the silence of regret. It is something closer to the silence that follows when a very heavy door long in the closing finally seats. The fleet did not fire. I want to be precise about this because the commemorations sometimes imply a battle, and there was not in the conventional sense a battle. What there was positioning. The fleet held the gap and the hegemony's patrol forces held their positions, and the two forces existed at a distance from each other. That made the power differential visible without requiring it to be demonstrated through destruction. This was, I later learned, the specific intention of the fleet commander, a woman named Admiral Tella Oris, who had served with Sarah Omelin in the Scarith campaigns and who had apparently told her operations staff that she did not want to fire unless the feast hegemony made it necessary, because she was interested in making the hegemony understand something, and you cannot teach someone anything by destroying their capacity to understand. What Tella wanted the Hegman to understand was not difficult to state. She wanted them to understand what had actually agreed to 400 years ago, when they had signed an accord with species that they had intended to remain their inferiors, and that had instead, over 4 centuries of quiet, persistent, unglamorous work, become something else entirely. She wanted them to understand that the accord they had signed had teeth that they had never looked at carefully, and that those teeth were now visible, and that the visibility of the teeth was the direct consequence of their own choice to kill a woman I did not know was carrying 4 centuries of legal weight on her shoulders. She did not tell them this in words. She told them with the fleet, the hegemons. Formal request for armistice came on the 17th day after the fleet's emergence from the gap. The request was addressed to the Compact Worlds Council in the full formal diplomatic mode, with all appropriate seals and protocol signatures, which was the hegemony's way of aiming that they were no longer treating the situation as a border incident requiring administrative resolution. The armistice request, acknowledged in language that their own Treaty Council had clearly spent significant effort crafting, that review of the Amhara Accords indicated certain provisions of relevance to the current situation that warranted further examination, and proposed that both parties withdraw to pre-incident positions while a joint commission reviewed the applicable legal framework. The language was careful and not quite honest. Certain provisions of relevance was doing an enormous amount of work in that sentence, but the request was genuine, and the Council accepted it, not because the Council trusted the hegemony's intentions, but because the armistice served the immediate purpose of stopping a situation from becoming something that would require generations to repair. The Compact Worlds fleet withdrew from the Aldrich Gap on an orderly schedule. The hegemony's forces withdrew from Valimhara Station. The detained personnel were released, all of them on a timeline that the subsequent inquiry established had been accelerated significantly by the fleet presence. They came home in stages over about 10 days, moving through a transit process that the Compact Worlds mission coordinated with the kind of exhausted, careful precision that people bring to work when they are operating on the other side of a long relief. General Omelin did not come home. She had been dead for 62 days by the time the last of her colleagues crossed back into Compact World space. The Joint Commission review took 2 years. I was assigned to it in the first month in a role that I will describe as more substantive than my archive desk at the secondary hub, and less dramatic than what my 15-year-old memo might have warranted if anyone had acted on it when it was filed. I reviewed treaty provisions. I wrote analyses. I sat in very long meetings and answered questions from people who were discovering in real time the depth and complexity of a document that their predecessors had filed away as ceremonial. There was a parallel process on the hegemon side, which I observed only from a distance, but which the declassified records have since made comprehensible. Casavar III, ascendant, was removed from command within 6 days of the armistice request, not by the Compact Worlds, who had no authority over hegemony personnel, but by the hegemony's own sovereign council, which had made a swift determination that he was the proximate cause of a situation that had cost them significantly, and which had further determined that this determination should be visible. He was stripped of rank and title and assigned to an administrative posting on a world in the outer territories, where he lived quietly for 11 more years before dying of causes unrelated to any of this. His deposition, which forms part of the commission record, is a remarkable document, not because it is honest exactly, but because the dishonesty is so carefully constructed that you can see the shape of what he actually understood. Underneath it, he knew that he had not checked the roster. He knew that this was a failure. He did not say this in those words because saying it in those words would have required him to admit to a kind of negligence that he was not constitutionally capable of admitting to, but the shape of the evasion tells you what the admission would have been. The hegemony's treaty apparatus underwent a comprehensive review during the 2 years of the commission, driven partly by the external pressure of the commission itself and partly by the internal faction I described. The people who had been trying to get the review conducted for years and who now had in the most painful possible form the authorization they had needed. The review found what any careful reading would have found, that the Wilmhara Accords were operational, comprehensive, and binding in ways that the hegemony's official summaries had systematically understated. The review also found that this understanding had been available within the hegemony's own treaty apparatus for decades, and that the institutional mechanisms by which it had been suppressed were themselves now comprehensively documented. This last finding was the one that the hegemony's leadership found most difficult to manage, because it meant that the situation was not the result of a single officer's negligence or a single deputy director's dismissal of a memo. It was the result of a structural preference maintained at multiple levels over multiple generations for institutional comfort over institutional accuracy. The Commission did not include this finding in its public documents. The Compact World's delegation agreed to its omission, and not because they were protecting the hegemony's reputation, but because including it would have made the Commission's primary work, revising the Accord, substantially harder, and because the primary work was what actually mattered. The hegemony's internal tribunal produced its own conclusions on this question, and those conclusions are now in the public record, and I will say only that they were more honest than I expected and less honest than the situation required. This is perhaps the best that can be said for any institution examining its own failures. From the inside, the Commission produced a revised framework for the Wilmhara Accords, one that restated the operative provisions in language that the hegemony's own legal scholars had reviewed and could not claim was ambiguous. Article 14 was among the most extensively revised provisions. The new language was precise, the consequence clause was explicit, and the investment procedures for the treaty kept a rank were updated to require notification to all signatory parties at the time of each new investment, so that there could be no future claim by anyone that the status of the holder was unknown or unclear. The Hegman signed the revised Accords. The signing ceremony was held at Wilmhara Station, which seemed appropriate to everyone involved, and which I am told was somewhat tense on the day, but concluded without incident. I was not at the ceremony. By that point, I had been rotated back to the Joint Treaty Commission circuit, where I spent the next 14 years continuing to do the work I was good at, reading documents until they gave up their secrets, and sitting with what I had read until I understood it completely. What I can tell you about the years between the commission and my retirement is that the relationship between the compact worlds and the hegemony did not become warm or easy or free of the tensions that had produced the Amhara crisis. It became different. The difference was not in the words people used or the meetings they held or the formal courtesies they exchanged. The difference was in the quality of attention. The hegemony's treaty officials read the documents now. They read them the way I had been reading them, all the way through past the summary clauses into the operative provisions that required the archaic idiom to unlock when a new provision was filed or an existing one amended. The review was real rather than notional. When a treaty keeper was invested, the notification went to all parties within 72 hours. The machinery of the accords ran on attention, and attention is the one thing that institutional habit is worst at sustaining, and that crisis is most efficient at creating. I cannot tell you whether this change will hold for another 400 years. I cannot tell you whether the next generation of hegemony treaty officials raised in a world where Amhara is history rather than living memory will develop the same comfortable certainty that their predecessors had. I have some reason to hope they will not, and some reason to expect that institutional memory is shorter than the documents that contain it, and I am not sure which of these is more accurate. Both are probably true in different proportions at different times, and the proportions shift in ways that are not predictable in advance. I retired at 67 to the house on the coastal ridge. I have lived there for 16 years. The sea makes the sound it makes, and in the mornings the light comes through the east window at an angle that shifts with the seasons in a way I have been watching long enough to find comfortable. People ask me sometimes whether I think the outcome was worth the cost. They mean by this whether Sarah Omelin's death was a cost that produced something commensurate. I do not answer this question because it is the wrong question. The cost was incurred by the hegemony when they killed her. The outcome was produced by the text of an accord that 400 years of signatories had collectively agreed to be bound by. The causal chain runs through human choices at every step. Cathar's choice to detain, his choice to execute the compact world's councils, choice to recognize what the accords required, Admiral Orr's choice to hold the gap without firing the hegemonies, choice to request armistice rather than commit further. Whether that chain of choices and consequences was worth the cost is a question for the people who made those choices, and most of them are dead, and the ones who are not have already given their answers in the form of how they lived the years after. There is a question I find more useful, which is what did it take for the accords to function the way they were written to function, and the answer which I have been turning over for 31 years is this: it took one person in one archive room reading one document all the way through, everything that followed the memo, the dismissal, the 15 years of sitting with what I had read, the phone call, the convening, the vote, the fleet, the armistice, the commission. The revised language was downstream of that one act of reading. This is not a comfortable answer. It would be more comfortable if the accords had functioned because the system was designed correctly, or because the right people were in the right positions, or because some institutional mechanism caught what individual attention missed. But the accords did not function because the system was designed correctly. The system had been designed by the accumulated habits of generations to not notice what the accords actually said. The accords functioned because 1. Junior Adesh in a climate-controlled reading room on Valdrich Prime read Article 14 on a Tuesday morning and understood it and wrote a memo that was filed away and not acted on, and kept the memo and did not let go of what he had read even when the institution told him he was being overly literal. I do not tell this to make a hero of myself. I was not a hero. I was a minor official who did his job carefully in a system that did not reward careful reading, and who had the stubbornness, or perhaps the vanity, to refuse to decide that the system's assessment of his memo was more reliable than his own reading of the document. The heroism, if there was any, belonged to the people in the convening room, who voted knowing what would follow, and to Admiral Orris, who held the gap for 40 days without firing, and to the delegates at Velimhara Station, who signed a revised accord in a room where the air was tense with everything that had happened in that corridor, and did it anyway because the alternative was worse. What I can tell you, what I have spent 31 years being able to tell you, and what I am telling you now because the classification has lapsed, and because I am 83 and I have nothing left to protect except the truth, is that Article 14 was not ambiguous. It was never ambiguous. It was precise and operative, and it meant exactly what it said. And a deputy director at a secondary diplomatic mission informed me 15 years before it mattered that I was being overly literal. I was not being overly literal. The hegemony killed a treaty keeper. The treaty specified the consequence. The consequence was exact, and it followed with the weight and patience of language that had been written to endure, not because anyone had planned for that specific morning, or that specific execution order, or that specific woman carrying 4 centuries of legal weight she had never been told about, but because the people who wrote it had known, in the way that people who negotiate with powerful parties always know, that the language needs to hold for longer than the moment, and that the teeth need to be there even when everyone has agreed for reasons of convenience to pretend they are not. Sarah Omelin was 51 years old. She had been decorated 4 times. She held a treaty keeper rank she had not been meaningfully briefed on in a document that a deputy director at a secondary hub had described as ceremonial, and she died on a Tuesday in the 11th day of a detention that should never have happened, on an order from an officer who had not checked the roster carefully enough. I keep her picture in the house. It is a formal portrait from her last promotion ceremony, the one taken 6 months before the Velimhara posting. Clear-eyed in uniform, with a slight forward tilt of the head that people have when the photographer has just said something they find moderately amusing. She is not smiling exactly. She is on the near side of a smile, holding it the way that people hold things they do not entirely trust to last. I have read Article 14 more times than I can count. I read it again this morning before I began writing this account. In the copy I have kept since Valdrich Prime, the same archival print annotated in a younger hand that I recognize as mine. And that looks strange to me now. Weigh all evidence of your younger self. Looks strange once enough time has passed. The language is the same. The teeth are the same. whatever comes next. In the long argument between the compact worlds and the hegemony will happen in the shadow of what was written 400 years ago by people who understood that the only agreements worth writing are the ones that mean something when the other party has decided for reasons of their own that they no longer apply. They always apply. That is the whole of what I know. The record is the record. The accords are the accords. I have told this story once before under oath to a sealed hearing. I am telling it again now to whoever reads it, because the truth does not become less true when the people it is most inconvenient for have decided it is no longer urgent. It keeps like a treaty clause that has been filed away and not looked at for a century. It keeps and it waits, and when the moment comes that requires it, it is exactly as precise and operative as it was on the day it was written. I was not being overly literal.